Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'll just briefly say the first time I was in Afghanistan was shortly after we went in '01, and I observed that it was a shithole. I observed that it was never much of a country. I went to the so-called palace, and I was underwhelmed by the facility that the king had occupied. So it doesn't surprise me that 20 years later we still had problems. During that time, I saw rapid corruption, including Karzai, who he and his brother raped the country of, let me rephrase it, raped the American taxpayers of billions of dollars. We can talk for as long as anyone is allowed about the failures of Afghanistan, but I do want to talk about the subject du jour here for a moment. Sergeant Major, you laid out the difference in the facilities, one which was defendable, one which was able to almost occupy a siege if necessary, but if I'm correct, would have required some flexibility in the number of personnel. In other words, if you have a mandate of less than 1,000 and they have to include the embassy, then you really don't have the flexibility to use Bagram. Is that correct?
Sir, Bagram, that being such a large military installation, it had 84 guard towers, and that takes a significant amount of manpower to man.
So given maybe double the amount, 2,000 or so, you could have defended that air base, and that's 2,000 not including the people operating aircraft and other things that might have been left there. But Bagram could have been maintained and would have been safer had we had some flexibility from the Commander-in-Chief as to the number of personnel, correct?
Sir, if you had 2,000 people, Bagram would be a much safer location.
Okay, Colonels, I'll address you together for a moment. You both went to the war colleges. You both went Command and General Staff. So I'm going to go through a little quick history. I'll try to be as quick as possible. During Vietnam, the now 100-year-old Henry Kissinger negotiated what some would call a flawed agreement. You know, they had these peace agreements. But both during the time and afterwards, isn't it true that when Richard Nixon saw failures to comply, saw aggression, saw an attempt to take ground by his adversaries, being the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, he bombed the shit out of them? Is that correct, using a technical military term? Am I not remembering history, that if you're non-compliant with it, that the Commander-in-Chief uses his or her authority to essentially let them know that there was a consequence for not obeying an agreement?
That is my recollection.
Okay, so knowing that the Commander-in-Chief had a history in what people often call that failed withdrawal of Saigon, which, by the way, was long after we had left and our military had left, and it really was a post-period, we certainly could have a discussion about failure to plan a neo-sufficient. I'd like to just go on to one other, Benghazi. There are similarities with Benghazi, which seems to be there was no plan to withdraw, the military didn't know who could do it, and the like. And the facilities were insufficient. In the investigation of Benghazi, what did we find? We found that the facilities chosen, the facilities in which the ambassador was hunkered down, were not compliant with any State Department requirements. In fact, he died because the fuel tank was right next to where he was supposed to be in a safe house. So, Sergeant Major, I'm going to come back to you. The actual loss of 160 human beings plus and 13 of our service members, can it be reasonably attributed to the difference in facilities chosen between Bagram versus HKIA?
So the events that happened on Abbey Gate, I believe that if that would not have occurred in Bagram. The defense that Bagram held, the ability to see for hundreds of meters, and the defense in depth of those control points, I do not believe the result would have been the same.
Okay. I'm not going to defend the work of the Secretary of State, Pompeo, in the Doha agreement, but I will ask Colonel Cargrim, I think I'll start with you. Am I correct that there roughly were sort of 9 months and 9 months, 9 months of the Trump administration, followed by 9 months of, nearly 9 months of the Biden administration? Each of them had 9 months, more or less, to make decisions on that plan. What would you say were the fatal flaws during that first 9 months? Did, for example, the Trump administration withdraw troops to an artificially low level? Did they signal in a way that would cause people to evacuate go through just quickly, were there actions during the Trump administration that you can say absolutely led to the events that cost 13 members' lives that you can point to today?
Not during the Trump administration. I don't see a direct causation during that time period.
And wasn't there, during that next 9 months, plenty of times to make adjustments based on the actions of the Taliban during that next 9 or so months?
In my opinion, there was time to make adjustments.
And were there any adjustments made that you know of during that period of time that said to the Taliban that there would be consequences for their violations?
No, and that was our failure in the Doha agreement. We did not hold them accountable to meeting those conditions, yet we continue to withdraw.
Okay. Lastly, the closing, the release at the time of that 5,000 to 7,000 bad guys, if you will, was that related to the agreement, or was that inherently related to the closing of Bagram?
I don't know the answer to that question.
Well, were they released essentially simultaneous with the closing of the air base? Sergeant Major, you were probably the closest to knowing the time schedule.
Sir, I do not know the timeline.
Okay, we'll take that one to find out later. Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for your indulgence.